There was a moment in European history when a duke dared to believe that a crown was optional. That legitimacy could be forged not by ancestry or blessing, but by force, wealth, and will. In the fractured heart of the 15th century, this belief took flesh in one man, Charles of Burgundy, known to history as Charles the Bold. He was born into privilege unmatched by most kings. Burgundy was not a poor vassal state, but the richest political body in Western Europe. Its cities thrived on trade, its coffers overflowed with gold from cloth markets and river tolls. While France struggled with debt and war, Burgundy glittered with wealth, discipline, and ambition. Charles grew up knowing that his resources surpassed those of the very monarch he was supposed to obey. Unlike his father Philip the Good, who mastered influence through alliances and subtle control, Charles rejected shadows. He did not want to guide kings from behind curtains. He wanted to stand above them. Power in his mind was not something to manipulate. It was something to possess openly, visibly, and without apology. Charles envisioned a new empire carved not from dreams, but from geography. A continuous realm stretching from the North Sea down to the Alps. Lands bound together by roads, armies, and law rather than feudal promises. He imagined a centralized state with a permanent army loyal to him alone. Courts that answered to Burgundy, not Paris. A political body strong enough to rival France and independent enough to challenge the Holy Roman Empire itself. If this vision became reality, France would not merely face a rival. The Valois Dynasty would be trapped between two powers, with Burgundy rising like a wall inside what was once its own domain. Charles was not asking for recognition. He was daring Europe to stop him. What made his ambition dangerous was not just its scale, but its clarity. Charles knew exactly what he wanted, and he was willing to gamble everything for it. His dream was no longer personal glory. It was a direct challenge to the order that had ruled Europe for centuries. And when one man challenges the balance of an entire continent, history begins to tremble. If you want to follow how this gamble unfolds, and how one duke forces kings to react, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey through the shadows of power. While Charles the Bold chased glory in open fields, another ruler was rising in silence. Louis XI of France did not look like a king from songs or tapestries. He wore plain clothes, favored narrow corridors over grand halls, and trusted ink more than steel. Where others sought admiration, Louis sought control. Louis inherited a fractured kingdom. The crown was weak, the nobility defiant, and Burgundy loomed like a state within a state. He understood something his rivals did not. France could not survive another generation of open confrontation. Strength had to be rebuilt quietly, patiently, and without spectacle. So Louis ruled from the shadows. He surrounded himself with letters, messengers, and informants. His court was not a place of tournaments, but of whispers. Every noble family, every merchant guild, every border town became a thread in a growing web. Gold moved where swords could not. Promises replaced threats. Secrets became weapons sharper than any blade. This was how Louis earned his name, the Spider King. He did not charge at enemies. He waited. He let ambition pull them forward until they were tangled by their own momentum. His victories were invisible at first. A delayed supply line here, a disgruntled ally there. A rumor planted at the right time could weaken an army before it ever marched. Burgundy was his greatest concern and his greatest opportunity. Louis did not underestimate Charles the Bold. He studied him. He understood Charles' need for recognition and his hunger for expansion. Where Charles built armies, Louis built uncertainty. He encouraged resistance in border regions. He supported rival claims quietly. He reminded imperial princes and city-states that a Burgundian empire would consume them next. Every move was calculated to isolate Charles without confronting him directly. Louis knew that Burgundy's strength relied on momentum and unity. If that momentum stalled, if that unity cracked, the empire dream would collapse under its own weight. Unlike Charles, Louis XI had no interest in glory. He wanted survival, a stable crown, a France that could not be torn apart by powerful vassals ever again. To achieve that, he was willing to be hated, misunderstood, even feared. Knights mocked him for cowardice. Chroniclers called him sly. But kings across Europe watched closely because his methods worked. The stage was now set for a conflict unlike any before. Not a war of banners and charges, but a duel of minds. One ruler believed power should be seized by force. The other believed it should be engineered slowly until resistance vanished. Charles the Bold saw himself as a future emperor. Louis XI saw him as a problem that needed time. And in the space between those visions, history began to tighten, like a web waiting for its prey. Two men now stood at the center of Europe, and they did not merely oppose each other. They represented two incompatible visions of what power should be. Charles the Bold believed authority must be visible. Power for him lived in armor on the battlefield, in banners moving forward, and in decisions made without hesitation. A ruler proved himself by action, by conquest, by forcing the world to acknowledge his strength. To Charles, hesitation was weakness and compromise was surrender. He believed history belonged to those bold enough to seize it with their own hands. Louis XI believed the opposite. To him, visible power was fragile. Armies could be defeated. Cities could rebel. Glory faded quickly. True power was invisible. It lived in patience and anticipation, in knowing when not to act. Louis believed the strongest ruler was the one whose enemies never realized they were already losing. Time was his greatest ally, division his sharpest tool. Where Charles rode at the head of his forces, Louis remained still and observed. Where Charles demanded loyalty, Louis purchased it quietly, or waited until it dissolved on its own. Charles believed fear brought obedience. Louis believed uncertainty brought paralysis. Their difference shaped everything that followed. Charles moved quickly, building pressure on every border. His campaigns were loud and undeniable. Europe watched him expand and wondered who would be next. Louis did not respond with armies. He responded with delays, with doubts, with careful messages sent to the right people at the right moment. He allowed Charles to move while quietly reshaping the ground beneath his feet. Each man misunderstood the other in dangerous ways. Charles saw Louis as weak and evasive, a king afraid to fight. He mistook silence for fear. Louis saw Charles as predictable, a man whose pride would always push him forward even when caution was wiser. He understood that Charles' greatest strength was also his weakness. This was not simply a political rivalry. It was a collision between two philosophies of rule. One believed legitimacy came from force and honor. The other believed legitimacy came from control and endurance. Neither could coexist with the other. As Burgundy grew stronger on the map, Louis grew stronger in influence. As Charles pushed closer to his imperial dream, Louis tightened his web around allies, rivals, and borders. Every step forward for one became an opening for the other. Conflict was no longer a question of if. It was a question of how. And more importantly, of who understood the nature of power well enough to survive the coming test. Louis XI did not confront Burgundy with banners or declarations. He did something far more dangerous. He began to remove the ground beneath it. The web tightened slowly and almost invisibly. Louis understood that Burgundy did not stand alone because of Charles' strength, but because of the alliances holding it together. So he targeted those threads one by one. Dukes who once toasted Charles at lavish feasts began receiving quiet letters from Paris. Merchants whose wealth depended on Burgundian stability were offered safer routes and royal privileges elsewhere. City leaders were reminded that loyalty to a distant duke was optional when survival was at stake. Louis did not threaten. He persuaded. He delayed payments here and forgave debts there. Gold moved silently across borders, carrying promises instead of swords. Where armies would have provoked resistance, money created hesitation. Allies began to pause, to wait, to reconsider their future. Inside Burgundy, dissatisfaction began to surface. Not open rebellion, but murmurs. Cities complained of taxes that never seemed to end. Nobles questioned campaigns that brought glory but little security. Soldiers returned from war exhausted and unrewarded. Each complaint alone was manageable. Together they formed a quiet pressure that Charles refused to acknowledge. Charles the Bold responded in the only way he knew, with force. He demanded obedience rather than earning it. He tightened control, increased levies, and punished hesitation. What he saw as necessary discipline, others saw as arrogance. Each order meant to strengthen his rule instead pushed another supporter into silence or secret resentment. Louis watched and waited. He did not rush to claim credit. The brilliance of his strategy lay in invisibility. Burgundy began to fracture without a single French soldier crossing its borders. Allies drifted away not because they loved France, but because they feared isolation more than loyalty. Charles felt the shift, but misread it. He believed firmness would restore unity. That fear would silence doubt. Instead, it confirmed every whisper Louis had planted. The more Charles tried to assert dominance, the more alone he became. Europe noticed. Courts that once feared Burgundy now sensed weakness beneath the armor. Neutral powers leaned away. Potential partners hesitated. Charles' empire still looked formidable, but it was beginning to stand on hollow ground. Louis XI had achieved something remarkable. Without battle, he had turned Burgundian strength inward. The Duke who dreamed of an empire now faced resistance not from enemies at his gates, but from uncertainty within his own lands. The web had not snapped. It had closed. And Charles the Bold was walking deeper into it, without realizing how tightly it had already wrapped around him. Charles the Bold reached a moment where patience felt like surrender. The web around him was tightening, and he could sense it even if he refused to name it. Allies hesitated, cities delayed support, and respect began to sound conditional. To Charles, only one answer remained: war, not as defense but as declaration. If victory could no longer come through diplomacy, then history itself would be forced to bend by steel. He chose his battlefield poorly, but confidently. Switzerland and Lorraine stood in his path not as grand empires, but as stubborn obstacles. Charles believed they would break under pressure. His army was disciplined, his reputation terrifying, and his ambition unquestionable. What he underestimated was the nature of the enemies he faced. The Swiss fought not for glory, but for survival. Lorraine fought for its own existence. Neither feared Burgundy the way courts and merchants once had. Louis XI did nothing, and that was the point. He watched from a distance, allowing events to unfold without interference. No banners, no proclamations, no French troops marching east. By standing aside, Louis ensured that whatever blood was spilled would not stain his crown. Others would do the fighting. Others would bear the cost. France would simply collect the result. Charles pressed forward, believing speed and force would restore momentum. Each campaign was meant to prove that Burgundy remained unstoppable. Instead, each battle drained his strength further. Supply lines stretched, morale weakened, and confidence eroded. Victory slipped away, not in a single collapse, but through exhaustion and miscalculation. The fatal gamble was not the choice of war itself. It was the belief that war could solve what politics had already undone. Charles fought as if the world still respected raw power. But Europe had changed. Kings no longer needed to meet on battlefields to win. Influence could destroy empires without raising a sword. As Charles committed more troops and demanded greater sacrifices, Louis continued to wait. Every defeat cost Burgundy allies. Every retreat emboldened opposition. The Duke who once threatened to reshape Europe now fought simply to preserve what he already held. This was the brilliance and cruelty of the Spider King. He did not defeat Charles directly. He allowed Charles to defeat himself. The gamble that was meant to crown Burgundy instead stripped it of its future. By the time Charles realized the trap, it was too late. He had wagered everything on war, and history had accepted the bet. The final outcome was no longer in his hands. Charles the Bold did not fall in a moment of legend, but in cold confusion. His death came far from triumph, surrounded by mud, broken banners, and soldiers who no longer believed. When his body was found, the armor that once symbolized Burgundian dominance lay torn and unrecognizable. With him vanished the single force that had held the Burgundian world together. No ceremony marked the end of his dream. It ended where ambition meets reality on a battlefield that offered no mercy. The shock spread quickly. Burgundy had been built around one will, one voice, one vision. Without Charles, there was no figure capable of commanding the same loyalty or fear. His heirs lacked the authority to bind generals, merchants, and cities into a single purpose. What had looked like an emerging empire revealed itself as a fragile construction dependent on one man standing upright. Once he fell, the structure collapsed inward. Rival factions moved immediately. Territories hesitated, then defected. Alliances dissolved overnight. Armies once paid in Burgundian gold waited for new masters. The idea of Burgundy as an independent great power died faster than any army could retreat. Power did not transfer. It evaporated. Louis XI did not rush in with soldiers. He arrived with documents, seals, and legal claims prepared long in advance. While others mourned or fought among themselves, he activated treaties, marriages, and obligations that had been quietly secured over years. Each signature absorbed a city. Each agreement erased a border. What could not be taken by law was isolated until resistance became meaningless. This was not conquest as Europe had known it. No burning capitals, no triumphant charges. Burgundy was dismantled piece by piece through courts, councils, and contracts. Nobles who once feared Charles now pledged loyalty to France for protection and stability. Merchants chose predictability over pride. The population followed the path of least suffering. Louis' victory was absolute precisely because it appeared bloodless. There was no single moment to resist, no battlefield where Burgundy could rally. By the time the truth became clear, there was nothing left to defend. The Burgundian project was over not because it lost a war, but because it lost its reason to exist. The fall without mercy was also the fall without drama. History often remembers great collapses as storms. This one ended like a quiet night after a long illness. The empire that frightened Europe disappeared into the ledgers of another king. Louis XI never claimed glory. He did not need to. Burgundy had proven his philosophy correct. Power no longer belonged to the strongest sword. It belonged to the patient mind that understood when to wait and when to close the door forever. With Charles gone, Burgundy ceased to be a threat. France emerged stronger not through battle but through absorption. The age of reckless ambition ended here. A new era ruled by calculation had begun. Burgundy did not fall with a final battle or a heroic last stand. It faded from the map as if it had never been meant to last. What once stretched across trade routes, courts, and ambitions dissolved into provinces absorbed, renamed, and forgotten. The dream had been too large, too fast, and built on a single will. When that will disappeared, nothing remained to protect the shape it had carved into Europe. For the Valois, this disappearance was not merely survival, it was transformation. A dynasty once cornered by rivals emerged steadier, more centralized, and more cautious. The threat that had pressed against its heart vanished, and in its place stood a clearer path toward authority. France did not celebrate loudly. It recalculated. The crown learned that endurance mattered more than glory, and that patience could defeat power that looked unbreakable. Louis XI never needed to be remembered as a warrior. His victory lay in proving that the rules had changed. Knights' banners and heroic charges no longer decided the future alone. Influence moved through letters, agreements, and quiet pressure applied at the right moment. While others chased honor, he collected leverage. While rivals sought recognition, he erased alternatives. Burgundy collapsed because it fought the wrong war in the wrong age. What replaced it was a lesson written into the structure of the French state. Control would now flow downward from administration, not outward from conquest. Loyalty would be secured through incentives and dependencies, not fear alone. The crown learned to bind rather than to crush. This was the true inheritance left behind by the fall of Burgundy. Europe would remember Charles the Bold as the last man who believed sheer force could bend history to his design. Louis XI would be remembered differently, if at all. His power was invisible by choice. He understood that the most dangerous victories are those that look inevitable only after they are complete. As Burgundy vanished, merchants adapted, nobles swore new oaths, and borders hardened into something more permanent. The age of wandering ambition gave way to the age of calculated states. What had once been a contest of swords became a contest of systems. Valois did not simply win. It learned how to survive the future. And so the story closes, not with a coronation or a battlefield, but with a question that echoes beyond this dynasty and this century. In the long arc of history, who truly shapes the world? The one who holds the sword, or the one who pulls the strings? If you want to follow how power continues to change and how dynasties rise, fall, and adapt, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next chapter of this history.